Hi, and welcome back to my tarot series for beginners. Today we're going to be talking about tarot in psychology. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I work in the mental health field. I'm actually a psychotherapist, and so this is something that I think a lot about, this intersection between tarot and psychology, psychological theory, and how it is that we're approaching our clients. As I was putting together this video, it was hard for me to narrow down the focus. I think there's so much I could talk about when it comes to psychological theory and how that applies to tarot and the work that I do, but I tried to narrow it down so that this video won't be like 8 hours long. So I think it's fair for me to share a little bit about what my experience and knowledge and training is when it comes to psychology. I've been working in the mental health field since 2012. Currently, I specialize in mental health and substance use disorders. I also do a lot of work with folks in crisis. I generally keep my tarot world and my mental health world relatively separate. Like, I don't necessarily do a lot of tarot readings for my mental health clients at this point. But the work I do cuts both ways. My master's degree program focused on psychodynamic theory. Also, a lot of focus was on attachment theory and trauma as well. Since then, most of the places I've worked have focused on cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm also trained in like DBT, CBT. I've gotten a lot of training in REBT as well. And those therapies have a very different focus, but are also very, very useful. In recent years, I've been getting really interested in what's called depth psychology. So that's where we're stepping out of focusing on the mundane, on the rational, and we're looking at the subconscious. We're looking at these more mysterious, less explainable energies. I've also been interested in Buddhist psychology, especially since I've begun more meditation and Buddhist practice. There's a lot that Buddhist psychology has to offer, particularly when it comes to advancing towards wellness. It doesn't focus as much as like on psychopathology like Western psychology does, but it tells us a lot about the nature of consciousness and also how it is that we can progress past just our neuroses. I think it's important to state that tarot is not clinical psychotherapy. It's not clinical mental health treatment. However, I do firmly believe that tarot is a practice that can lead to a lot of healing. It can lead to spiritual growth. It can offer support for people in difficult times. And I've known a lot of folks that struggle with mental illness who do use tarot as one of their coping strategies, as something that they go to when they're struggling. From my experience in the tarot world, I've seen two main camps when it comes to reading, and I wouldn't say that these two camps are entirely distinct and separate. I think it's more blended than that, but I primarily see folks falling into either more predictive tarot, which is like kind of what we think of as fortune telling. So, you sit down and maybe they're claiming to be a medium or a psychic, and they're looking at, what are the spirits telling me? They're predicting the future. And on the other side, we have intuitive tarot, which is more about using tarot as a psychological tool. We also look at how it is that our own intuition is informing the messages and images that we're looking at when we're doing a reading for someone, and also how, like, if someone's having an association, say they see the emperor, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, that reminds me of my dad, right? That gives us something to talk about, something that is really personal and relevant to that person. I definitely fall more into the intuitive camp. I don't necessarily claim to be able to see the future. I do like how in Lord of the Rings, Galadriel, when Frodo is visiting Lothlorien, he looks into the mirror and, he sees these different futures, and that's what she tells him. She's like, basically explaining that divination is complicated and, where there's rarely ever just one possible future. And I think that's how I see it, where I am able to see multiple different potential futures, but I can't definitively say like, yes, this is the one that's going to come to pass. But I can give people a lot of useful information about what their options are and how the cause and effect may play out with the choices that they might make. So this whole predictive versus intuitive is really indicative of a larger debate, I think, which is really like, is tarot a magical tool, or is it fake? Like, is it simply just these like evocative archetypes, right? And so people debate back and forth, tarot is a tool of the devil or tarot is a bunch of shit. I think that, it's hard to necessarily pin it down. I have seen obviously that tarot is very effective as a tool. So I definitely don't think that it's just all bogus, all placebo. I think there are some things going on there. Can I definitively say that tarot is literally magical and that there's a spirit that's like telling you to pick a card? I don't know. I mean, maybe, who knows? Like, I can't definitively say one way or the other. And to me, I don't know that it really matters that much because, right, if a tool is working for me, I don't always need to know why. And maybe that's just me, right? Like, if you feel the need, you have to know why things work. Like, that's okay, go with that. But like, I like having a little bit of mystery. And so that's part of the fun of the tarot, is that I don't entirely know why it works or how it works, but I know for me that it does work. So this divides us up right into two camps. So there's kind of the magic camp and there's the psychology camp. And just like the predictive versus intuitive, this isn't really a distinctive thing, right? Some people definitely are like, yes, the tarot is magic, 100%, I believe. And other people are like, you know, I don't believe that the tarot is magic, but I think that as a psychological tool, it's very effective. And there's everything in between, right? For myself personally, I think I fall kind of in the middle where I like the idea of a little bit of magic, of a little bit of mystery, and I don't necessarily need the tarot to be magical because I think as a psychological tool, it holds its own. So for me, I allow those parts to be there, and then, you know, I make space for the mystery, for whatever else is going to arise, and I don't necessarily need to dissect it or, you know, put it under a microscope. I just appreciate it for having a spiritual experience. As a therapist, I think that's why there's a lot of hesitation. I know a lot of other therapists actually that read tarot, many of whom are very, very hesitant to even admit in public to people that they work within the mental health field that they use this, because there's so many assumptions, there's some stigma around like, oh, like, you know, are you a fraud? Are you an idiot? Like, you know, do you believe in magic? Like, you know, are you really doing things that are evidence-based? And so there's a lot that goes into that. For me, I've been more in a place where I don't necessarily need something to be objective truth to be meaningful. So like psychological healing, oftentimes, like there are certain aspects that we know that are very kind of predictable. And then there's a lot of stuff in between that's kind of still a mystery. Like, you know, why does one person in a family get PTSD from abuse and the other person turns out totally fine? We don't entirely know, right? Like there's all kinds of factors that are still up in the air. And so I like to leave a little space for like, I don't know everything, and that's okay. And, you know, if I enjoy something, if it provides meaning to me, it can be subjectively true, subjectively useful. That doesn't mean I'm going to go and tell everyone like, you know, you'd better start using tarot because, you know, it's the only thing, right? Like, I take it as like, this is how it's helpful for me. If it's helpful for you, awesome. And if not, you know, that's okay too, right? There's so many other ways to approach psychological growth. And when it comes to seeing tarot as magic versus psychology, I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. You know, I think you've got to find that answer for yourself. And, you know, I mean, the middle ground's okay too. Like you can have both. You can have tarot as both magic and psychology. This video will focus primarily on tarot as a psychological tool, and I want to still validate that there is room for magic, but I'm going to focus on psychological theories, how we can use and integrate those into tarot, and how some of the science around those theories shows up in the tarot work that we do. The main way that tarot works in psychology is that it provides images that are evocative, right? They bring up ideas, they bring up archetypes, themes, memories, all kinds of stuff for us. And that material is very useful because oftentimes the problem that we're dealing with, we may not be able to consciously identify what the root or source of that is, but there's a part of our mind, right, the unconscious or the subconscious, may have some information for us. And so the tarot helps to dredge up that which is in the subconscious or in the unconscious so that we can then take a look at it and deal with it in the light of day. Tarot also helps us to take a look at the problem from a global perspective, right? It's kind of a zoom out sometimes where maybe we're really fixated on this one detail of the problem, but when we look at the cards, we can see a different point of view. In Buddhist psychology, we talk about samskaras. So samskaras are what we would call like karmic grooves where like say that you you stole something, and then, you keep doing it, and it's kind of like a wagon wheel that wears a rut in the mud, and the more you do something, the deeper the samskara goes, the harder it is to heal, right? And then sort of just we end up just kind of like a marble down a chute, just kind of going through these samskaras, just really mindlessly not paying attention. And most people live their lives just kind of like marbles and chutes, just going through the samskaras, just doing what they've always done. And so part of enlightenment, part of waking up, part of growing in Buddhist psychology is A, becoming aware of your samskaras, and B, working to heal them, working to create new patterns. So samskara can be positive or negative, wholesome or unwholesome, skillful or unskillful. And so we want to create new grooves that lead us down healthier patterns. So tarot is really great at helping people to become aware of patterns, aware of samskaras that are hurting them. So one thing that tarot helped me to become aware of was my tendency to see potential romantic partners in a fantastical sense, right? So not really connecting to the person, but seeing the fantasy version of them. And inevitably the fantasy version was always way better than the real version. But it was really unsatisfying, right? But tarot helped me to pick up on that pattern and see that. And once I was aware of it, I could then make a change. Because if we don't know that something is happening, it's really hard for us to target it, and try to do something different. So that's part of the utility of tarot, is being able to, take a look at what's going on and gain some insight into your patterns. So when I'm thinking about how it is that people make use of tarot, I divided things into primarily 3 levels. So the first level is seeking what I might call mundane guidance. So this is like, should I take the new job? Should I break up with my boyfriend? Like what do I need to do with my life, right? It's those looking at what's happening in the material world and what it is that we might do about it. So any problem that relates to something, like usually in our day-to-day lives, we're thinking just real straightforward, what's happening in my world here, like in the physical world. So this involves giving people guidance on these day-to-day decisions. It can even involve helping them with coping strategies and, validating what's going on for them, helping them to find clarification. This type of guidance is very important, right? We all need help in our day-to-day lives, sometimes making decisions, figuring out what's going on. And so I'm not presenting these levels as like in some kind of hierarchical order. Mundane guidance is valuable and is something that we need as humans. So just because I'm using the word mundane, I'm not demeaning it or saying that it's less than or less important in some way. So then there's using tarot as a psychological tool. Right? This could be using tarot to help resolve grief and loss. We could be helping to provide someone insight into their patterns, into their psychology. We could be helping them with shadow work, looking at elements of themselves that they feel insecure about or that they don't like. So this is when we're doing work with someone, they're having some kind of disruption to their inner emotional and psychological life, and we're utilizing tarot to help hold space for them, help guide them through that, provide, some validation, some clarification, some insight. Then we can move more into the spiritual layer. And the distinction between spirituality and psychology is actually much thinner than some might suppose, because when we're really looking at helping people find meaning in their life, right, helping them to be happy, that often ends up having a very heavy spiritual component along with what's going on psychologically. So when we're looking at psychological work, we have kind of the inner world, but then when we take it to the spiritual level, it's about connecting to something larger than ourselves, finding meaning in our existence, in everyday life, in our relationships, in our identity. And this work is very important. I think this is often where the magic element of tarot comes in, because some of the spiritual stuff, it's not, there's not like a lot of like randomized control trials about it, like we're in uncharted territory in some ways where it's very highly individualized and there's not a lot of right or wrong. It's more about, experience and finding what works for you. For instance, in depth psychology, there's this idea that, say you're involved in a conflict with someone and you're really butting heads and it's really miserable and you're like, what's going on, right? Like the mundane aspect of things would look at like, okay, well, like, what are some specific strategies you could use for having a difficult conversation or resolving conflict? And that's really useful, right? Like that's a good thing. Like we need that stuff. On a psychological level, right, we might look at who this person reminds you of, and maybe they remind you of your mother and you really struggled to get along with your mother and you have to resolve some feelings in order to not let this trigger you. And then on a spiritual level, we might look at, like from depth psychology, the perspective that we're each stepping into a role, right? Maybe the role is to be the aggressor. Maybe the role is to be, the doormat. And these roles aren't really personal. They don't really belong to us. We just kind of step in and out of them as life leads us by different kinds of situations. And when we can step out of the role and recognize like, oh, like I'm playing a part in a larger cosmic drama, sometimes it helps us to have more compassion for ourselves and the other people involved, and then also de-identify, right? So we're no longer like, I am this conflict, I have to win because this is all about me and this is my identity. You're stepping out and you're saying like, oh, this is just a thing that's happening. This doesn't have to necessarily mean something about me, about my identity. It helps us to get a little space from it. And a lot of tarot decks definitely emphasize this connection to what we might call the collective unconscious. That's a Jungian term. And it's this idea that there's sort of this stored reservoir of knowledge within consciousness, right? That like if human beings were conscious, that there's this sort of pool of consciousness that we all come from and that we all share together. And we're not always very aware of it. But for instance, a lot of tarot decks are adding a card at the end of the deck after the world that symbolizes the collective unconscious. For instance, the Fountain Tarot has the Fountain card. The Star Child Tarot has the Akashic Records card. So this is starting to come more into our vocabulary as tarot readers. And this idea has been in depth psychology for a very long time and in indigenous cultures for even longer. As a mental health professional, I feel like it's really important for my field to acknowledge that a lot of the work that we do, we did not invent, right? Like indigenous cultures have had psychological and spiritual healing methods that they've used for thousands and thousands of years. And the majority of Western stuff either was taken from those ideas or was kind of discovered by someone else separately, just like thousands of years later. So for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy is like, when you read Buddhist psychology, which has been around a long freaking time, like you're like, whoa, like this is all cognitive therapy. And it's like, yeah, like, the Buddhist scholars like figure this shit out like, centuries ago. I mean, and so we have to be, I think we have to acknowledge where a lot of this knowledge comes from. And so I want to make that really explicit in this video. I think that every tarot reader, if they're really serious about their journey, should take some time to study psychology and study human development so that they have a really strong foundation to work with their clients on. This could look like, going and taking a college course. It could look like reading books. It could be going and getting a PhD, right? There's all different kinds of ways to learn about psychological theory. I mean, you really could get quite a comprehensive foundation of psychological theory just by watching videos on the internet and reading articles. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of some of the theories that I think are most helpful, most applicable. And let me know in the comments below if you have other theories that you really like or you think are really helpful to you in your work as a tarot reader. So the first theory I think is foundational is just learning about human development, right? Like, who are we as a species? What happens to us? We are conceived, we are in utero, and then we're born, we become, infants, toddlers, we become children, we grow up, adolescents, into adulthood, and then what does that look like? And I think that when we can better understand the life cycle and the developmental perspective, it helps us just to have a better sense of what we can expect when it comes to humans. And then I think it helps you to pinpoint, because there are a lot of adults, right, that their bodies have developed, but their emotional side, their psychological side has not. And when you can pinpoint a little more accurately, where are they at in their like emotional and psychological development. That helps you to tailor how you're interacting with that person, so that you're connecting with them in a way that's helpful. So frequently in my work, just in general in life, like I meet a lot of people, like say I'm working with a man in therapy and he is, 30 years old, but psychologically it's as though he's 12, right? Like I have to interact with him really differently because it's basically like I'm working with a teenager. And this happens to me a lot. Sometimes I have clients who it's like, wow, like, emotionally, like you're like 1 or 2. So I see this in a really pronounced way in my work. It may not come up as much to the severity that I see it in my like psychological work, just because I'm working with people that are, really, really struggling. But it's a good thing to have on your mind. Like, where is this person at developmentally? Because it may surprise you how many people really have not gotten the opportunity to develop themselves as like a full emotional being. I also think that the human development theories help us to have compassion. Sometimes we meet people, especially adults, and we're really frustrated with them. Maybe they're annoying, maybe they're not very nice, maybe they're difficult in some way. And if we can look at their lives and think about what they've gone through, maybe the lack of love or parenting or skills training that they've had, it can help us to understand like, wow, like if I grew up in those circumstances, I might also have the same kind of problems that they're having. So that leads perfectly into a theory that I think is foundational for any kind of work when you're connecting with other people. And that theory is called attachment theory. Attachment theory is widely utilized in all kinds of different fields in psychology. Hopefully, I'm hoping that teachers also learn about this. I don't know, but like if you aren't, you should be. Add that to your curriculum. So attachment theory was initially developed by John Bowlby and then also Mary Ainsworth, and it posits the idea that the relationship you have with your primary caregivers as a very young child, is like we want to say from like birth to like 2 to 4 years old, that foundational experience sets the groundwork for how it is that you interact with others and how you perceive yourself for the rest of your life. Like no pressure, parents. But it's really true, right? Because like if you have negative experiences as an infant, we've seen how that affects us through the lifespan, right? It impacts our ability to trust other people. It impacts how we see ourselves and how we're able to like do what we call self-soothing or take care of ourselves. It makes people more likely to have an addiction or a mental illness, even to have like health problems. So in attachment theory, right, we say like in an ideal situation, the caregiver attunes to the needs of the child, to the infant feels understood, feels seen, feels loved, has their needs met, right? We call that a secure attachment. So in the opposite, in an insecure attachment, this is where the child has not bonded with the caregiver, or the caregiver has not bonded with the child, and say that the mother leaves and the child maybe is really upset and cries, but then when the mother comes back, the child is just kind of listless and doesn't make efforts to bond with the caregiver, or the child is unable to be soothed, right? That would be examples of an insecure attachment. So like, for instance, if you had a child a little older, maybe say like 4 or 5, and when they reunite with their caregiver, they don't seek to connect with the caregiver, that's troubling, right? Like if, they haven't seen their parent all day and they're just like, don't want to look at the parent, don't want to touch the parent, won't talk to the parent, right? Like there's something going on there that might need to be addressed. So what does all that have to do with tarot? So, we know now that someone's attachment style as an infant, so whether they're secure or insecure, and then there's a number of different attachment styles within insecure. We've got like fearful avoidant, preoccupied, disorganized. We know now that your attachment style as an infant predicts your adult attachment style. So adults also have secure and insecure attachment styles. So we see this for adults in their romantic relationships. It definitely comes up in friendships. And then it also will usually reflect how they then interact with their own children. So we've all had that tarot client who like emails you or calls you and is like, oh my God, I need a reading right away. Like everything is wrong and you have to help me like right now. And you're like, whoa, like, hold on a moment. Like, I'm not like a firefighter. You can't just like call me up and like have me like type out a reading for you right away, right? Maybe some people do that. I don't know. But usually that's a red flag to me. Like if somebody contacts me and wants a reading like right now and is really distraught when I tell them like, you know, I can get back to you in 24 to 48 hours or whatever the time frame it is that I have, usually that tells me that that person likely has what we might call a preoccupied or anxious attachment style, where we might use the word like, and it's kind of a negative word, the word clingy, right? When someone like is like, I need you or I'm not okay, that's what that is. Where it's like they're constantly like looking to the caregiver because they haven't internalized a sense of security and stability on their own. They need the other person to help them feel stable and secure, but they only feel that way when the person is interacting with them and showing and validating like, yes, I'm here, yes, I love you, yes, I care about you. The second they're gone, it's like when you take a toy away from a toddler, it's like it doesn't even exist anymore. Or actually I should say an infant, because toddlers have object permanence. Yeah, it's like they can't even remember what it felt like for that person to love them. They can't hold on to it. They can't internalize it properly. So with those kind of clients, I am really firm and I set boundaries and I say, you know, I want to help you and this is my policy. I will get a reading back to you in 24 to 48 hours because I know that if I go along with it, if I just, you know, send that reading out right away, I'm just reinforcing that old pattern. I'm not teaching them anything new. It's not necessarily effective with someone like this to be really like cold and cut off, but I think it's okay to set a boundary and still be warm and say like, I care about you, I want to help, and here's what I can offer you. And then for them having that learning process of like, oh, you know, someone is offering caring and they're doing it in a way that is more contained, has more of a sense of definition and boundaries. If you're looking for an author to read more about attachment theory, I highly suggest reading the work of Dan Siegel. He's a physician and also does a lot of research on neuroscience and what we call the neuroscience of attachment. He makes things very understandable. He goes over it in great detail. So I would check out his work if you want to learn more about attachment theory. The other kind of theory I'd like to focus on today is trauma theory. So trauma is defined as an event that occurs, something that I think in the past people use the language extraordinary, but unfortunately a lot of trauma is not super extraordinary because it happens all the time. So it's something that happens that induces a sense of terror that is unmanageable in some way for us, right? Like maybe we're in a really horrific car accident, maybe we suffer a traumatic loss, perhaps we experience abuse or a sexual assault, or we're in a domestic violence situation. There's so many different kinds of trauma. This can include being involved in war, serving in the military in a combat zone. You know, it can involve emotional abuse. So there's a lot of possibilities as to what trauma is, and a lot of how we define trauma depends on how the individual experiences it. When we're considering the severity of trauma, we're often actually looking at the subjective experience of the individual. So two people could experience the same event, and one person might experience it as much more traumatic than the other person. And we actually see this happening all the time. If you have a client that's experienced or is experiencing severe trauma, they may need more than what you can give as a tarot reader. I think it's important to have a list of resources handy for your community, say, you know, domestic violence shelters, mental health hotlines, places where people can go get therapy or other mental health treatment, where someone can go if they're having a crisis, if they're suicidal. So keep that in mind as we're talking about trauma, that you want to stay in the realm where you have the knowledge and skills to be helpful to someone and not get in over your head. If someone is actively having a mental health crisis as a result of trauma, you may want to consider giving them some referrals to an appropriate place that can provide the stabilization. Someone can't really work through their trauma when they're in crisis, right? Like in a crisis, the thing someone needs is to stabilize first. So a lot of the work that we do in tarot that helps people process and make meaning really can only happen when someone's in a well enough place to be able to tolerate thinking about those memories, talking about that kind of stuff. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on where people are at. Trauma affects humans in some really significant ways, right? Obviously, there's emotional and psychological effects. There's also physical effects. Trauma rewires our brains, and Dan Siegel explains quite a bit about this in his work. So when we experience a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, and it's whatever's happening is too much for us to process, our brain kind of goes into default mode, right? The frontal cortex, these areas up here that help us make good decisions, think through complex problems, those kind of shut down and we go into like our amygdala, we get kind of hijacked, we're like pumped full of cortisol or adrenaline or other different kinds of things, and we look at what's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. So many people have heard of fight or flight, but we also know that there's an option called freeze. So obviously fight is where, you're like amped and you're like, I'm angry and I'm gonna, lash out as a result of what's happening. The flight is like that response, I just gotta get out of here, I just gotta leave, like physically. But the freeze is where we say, I gotta get out of here, but we don't do it physically, right? Our physical body stays where it is, but we mentally and emotionally and spiritually, we like go away, gone. And so this happens a lot, when you're in a situation, say that someone is being sexually assaulted. Maybe they are physically unable to leave the situation, or they're afraid that if they try to run away, they'll be killed or hurt or something bad will happen to them. Their mind just kind of shuts down as like a mercy thing. It's like, I don't even want to be here for this. Okay, gone, bye. And the body's there, right? And I think what happens is sometimes we have these traumatic experiences. We don't always have very good memory of what happened in our rational intellectual mind, but our body remembers, right? So then when your body senses something that brings you back to that, it lives in your body. We get people that are like, I had this traumatic thing happen and I'm doing great, but I have a lot of stomach aches or I have a lot of headaches. And it's like sometimes psychological or emotional symptoms get pushed into the body and turn into what we call somatic symptoms. So things like stomach distress, headaches, muscle, joint pain, all kinds of stuff like that. On a very fundamental level, trauma affects our ability to trust, to feel that the world is a safe place. Oftentimes, after someone has experienced serious trauma, they see danger around every corner. They don't know how to feel safe in their bodies, in their worlds, in their lives. After stabilization has occurred, an important part of the healing process is to make meaning of what happened. Viktor Frankl talks about this in his book, A Man's Search for Meaning, where, he was in a concentration camp he was in Auschwitz, I believe, and he found a way to process, to understand what happened to him, to make sense of it in some way. And when it comes to trauma, we have to do that. If we just feel like the world is horrific and meaningless, we go a little bonkers. So for instance, if you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, that's a good example of someone fragmenting as a result of being unable to make meaning of their trauma. Billy just kind of splits into all these different elements, he's kind of in these different worlds. That's someone that has not been able to integrate what's happened in a way that helps them to keep going. Although tarot is not a trauma therapy, I do think that tarot is a very effective tool for helping people to make meaning of the world and sense of their lives and themselves. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a really useful tool, and I also wanted to include a brief primer on how this works because I think it helps us to better understand what's going on both the mundane and the psychological levels. So one of the ideas in cognitive behavioral therapy, right, is that, a lot of times people will attribute poor behavior, poor habits to external events, right? Like, well, I did this because X, Y, and Z happened. Like there was a situation and that's why I did what I did. But we can often look, and when we look a little closer, we realize that there's a link missing there, right? So say that someone cuts me off in traffic, right? I'm in my head, I'm thinking like, ugh, like what an asshole, like how dare he, that's so disrespectful. Then I have an emotion, right? Which is maybe like anger, rage, frustration. And then let's say I rear end him because I'm really, really angry. I've never done that. I would probably not do that, but just hypothetically, right? So I could say, oh, well, he deserved it. Like he cut me off. And so I rear ended him because he was just such an asshole. But is that really true, right? Like, let's say a different example. Someone cuts me off in traffic. I think to myself, maybe he's going to visit his wife who's in labor. Maybe he's on the way to a really important meeting, right? Who knows what's going on in his life. Then I just feel kind of maybe mildly annoyed, but also kind of like, it's going to be okay. And then I just keep doing what I'm doing, right? So the same event happened, but I had a really different response to it. And the main difference was actually my thought pattern. So the way that I perceived the event, the way I interpreted it, is what led to the emotion and then what led to the subsequent action. So this is the foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's that really, if we want to see change in behavior, we need to target how we think about things, because that is ultimately going to lead in a change in how we feel about something, which will make us more likely to do or not do certain things. This is a helpful thing to keep in mind when reading for people, because a lot of times people will come to tarot wanting help making a change in their life, right? Maybe they want to have healthier dating partners, or they want to take better care of themselves, or they want to be a better communicator. And if we have that in our minds, we can remember, as we're talking to someone, to encourage them to examine their thought process rather than externalizing or blaming things that we can't control. Part of tarot, right, is helping people to focus on what do I have control over? What can I change in this situation, right? Like, say someone comes in and they're like, I need this person to be in love with me, right? Part of what we do as a tarot reader is say, like, okay, you're having this feeling, you're having this desire, but what are your real options, Like, could you tell this person how you feel? Do you need to practice some acceptance that maybe they don't feel the same way as you, right? Like, we often help people to better understand reality, and it helps us if we can already understand reality ourselves, right? So if we can have an accurate perception of what is the true root of a problem, we're a lot more likely to be able to really help someone figure that out. So I hope that you take away from this video some interest in checking out some different psychological theories that could be useful to you in your tarot practice. Please let me know if you have any thoughts or responses. I'd love to hear your comments below. If you enjoy this video, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be making a lot more videos in the future about tarot and psychology. It's a field I'm very passionate about, and I'm interested in how we can help each other learn and grow as tarot readers. Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe.